The Courage to Doubt Paul Tillich and the Quest for Meaning Chapter 1. A pastor's son in Starzeddel, Paul Tillich entered the world on August 20th, 1886 in the small village of Starzeddel, Germany. He was born into a long line of pastors and scholars. His father Johannes was the latest in that patrilineal succession, serving as the evangelical minister in Starzeddel's modest stone church. From his earliest days, young Paul seemed destined to follow that same path laid out before him. He was an inquisitive and serious child, fascinated by the rituals of faith that structured village life. As he grew older, he could often be found in a quiet corner, nose buried in a book of theology or philosophy from his father's study. His mother Mathilde recognized her son's insatiable intellectual curiosity and did her best to nurture it, though the options were limited in their rural East Prussian hamlet. She arranged for him to receive tutoring from the church elders in Greek, Latin, and biblical scholarship starting at the tender age of 8. Paul excelled in these studies, amazing his instructors with his precocious insights into matters of scriptural exegesis and religious doctrine. It was clear to all that he possessed a truly gifted mind coupled with a driving spiritual inquisitiveness far beyond his years. At the age of 12, it came time for the pivotal rite of confirmation. As Paul stood before the altar in his tailored black suit, his father beamed with pride witnessing this milestone along his son's path. In his confirmation essay, Paul articulated an understanding of theological concepts like divine revelation that seemed to come from an old soul. From that point on, Paul's trajectory as a rising theologian and minister seemed set in stone, at least to the eyes of those in Starzeddel. But even at that young age, Paul's brilliant mind ranged far beyond the traditional doctrinal boundaries. Fundamental questions burned within him about the paradoxes and ambiguities underlying religious teachings. He quietly harbored grave doubts about the core precepts of Protestant Christianity that no one around him could have imagined. Chapter 2. Existential Awakenings. As Paul entered adolescence, his childhood acceptance of religious dogma gave way to a profound existential crisis. The more he studied theology and philosophy, the more coherent his doubts became about the truthfulness of literal biblical interpretation. Fundamental questions tormented him about the nature of faith, ethics, and human existence itself. No longer could he simply accept scriptures as the infallible word of God. His inquiring mind demanded deeper truth and meaning beyond what was written in those ancient texts. Paul's brilliance allowed him to poke holes in even the most sophisticated apologetic arguments from his ecclesiastical mentors. At night, he would lie awake wrestling with the paradoxes that his tutors brushed aside through mental compartmentalization. How could an all-powerful, all-loving God permit the brutal suffering he saw all around him? If God's plan encompassed every event, how could humans have any true free will or moral accountability? What actually happened upon death? Was there indeed an eternal life or merely oblivion? These questions gnawed at Paul relentlessly. He found no reassurance in the familiar rituals and traditions that gave the adults around him such certainty and comfort. Quite the opposite. The more he observed the cultural inertia and insularity of the Starzeddel religious community, the more Paul recoiled from their unquestioning piety. His was a classically skeptical mind in the mold of Socrates or Nietzsche, unwilling to accept any belief without subjecting it to the highest standards of logic and evidence-based reasoning. Paul felt condemned to live perpetually in the howling existential wilderness of radical doubt. These crises of faith provoked intense bouts of anxiety and depression in the young man. He confided in no one, not even his doting parents, about the demons tormenting his sensitive psyche. Outwardly, Paul maintained the posture of a model student and upright youth. But inwardly, his brilliant mind spun in deepening existential vertigo. A pivotal turning point occurred when Paul first discovered the writings of Arthur Schopenhauer at age 16. Chapter 3. The Seduction of Pessimism. In the dusty attic of the Starzeddel church, surrounded by stacks of antiquated tomes, Paul Tillich made a discovery that would profoundly reshape his worldview. It was there that the 16-year-old first encountered the bluntly pessimistic philosophy of Arthur Schopenhauer. Poring over pages of Schopenhauer's The World as Will and Representation, Paul felt a dark awakening within his soul. Here was a voice giving full, unapologetic vent to all the doubts and negative intuitions he had been repressing. Schopenhauer's radical pessimism resonated deeply with the young theologian's nagging feelings that life was fundamentally defined by suffering, desire, and ultimate meaninglessness. Like a captivating siren's song, Schopenhauer seduced Paul's analytical mind with his elegant arguments deconstructing the flaws and hypocrisies underlying human existence and religious belief systems. The philosopher's articulation of life as a harsh, indifferent cycle of suffering struck a chord in Paul's troubled psyche. He observed this brutally pessimistic worldview echoed all around him. The hardscrabble villagers of Starzeddel lived lives of privation and backbreaking labor, only briefly alleviated by the fleeting escapism of church festivities. Tragedy and injustice seemed the unvarnished reality, from the abusive spouse to the childhood death to the crippling workplace accidents that were commonplace. Reading Schopenhauer's denial of free will and reduction of consciousness to a mere illusion generated in Paul a sense of liberation, as if the philosopher's acid perspicacity had burned away the last vestiges of naivete. His depression and consternation found their philosophical voice in Schopenhauer's uncompromising doctrines. But the influential thinker did not merely wallow in dysphoria and abnegation. He prescribed a radical asceticism and negation of individual will as the only path to diminish human suffering. This involved the renunciation of all transient desires and sources of worldly attachment or false satisfaction. Paul took these lessons to heart, attempting to cultivate a staunchly pessimistic mindset and denouncing the petty indulgences of his peers as pathetic vanities. He embraced a stance of rigid self-denial, eschewing friendships or any semblance of joie de vivre. An overtly dour and taciturn young man, he steadfastly projected an air of terminal disillusionment. Chapter 4. Broken on the wheel, Paul Tillich's single-minded embrace of Schopenhauerian pessimism plunged him into a deep personal abyss. His already turbulent inner life became dominated by profound melancholy, morbid rumination, and self-mortifying asceticism. The brilliant young theologian abandoned himself to relentlessly deconstructing and denigrating all sources of value, meaning, and beauty in himself, his community, and the world at large. He wore his cynicism and contempt for human existence like a badge of honor, a coping mechanism for the spiritual anguish devouring his soul. Paul's metamorphosis alarmed his parents, who watched helplessly as their son transformed into a gaunt, brooding recluse. His father Johannes attempted to intervene and reason with him, but could make no impact against the impregnable fortifications of Paul's rigid pessimism. Increasingly, the young man turning his back on village society altogether, rejecting family, friendships, church, and any ambition or direction in life. Paul grew slovenly and disheveled, passing days in a curtain-drawn bedroom amid whirlpools of acrid cigar smoke. He occupied these austere quarters like a monk in a cell, reading Schopenhauer and compulsively chronicling his dark meditations in leather-bound journals. In these soul bleak scribblings, Paul vented a torrent of bitter diatribes railing against what he perceived as the sheer vacuity and horror of the human condition. He excoriated the mindless conformity and banalities of village existence, fumed over the empty platitudes of church dogma, and proclaimed the abandonment of all his youthful callings and ambitions. Having glimpsed the abyss of meaninglessness underlying reality, Paul considered himself awake in a prison world, inhabited by sleepwalkers deluded by false hopes and desires. This caustic misanthropic freefall isolated him from his loved ones, indeed from all human contact and terrestrial concerns. Paul remained entombed in his room for weeks at a time, alternating between marathon bouts of feverish writing and insensate stretches of melancholic brooding. His hygiene and physical health deteriorated precipitously as he adhered to an extreme dietary asceticism, surviving on bread, water, and the occasional potato. The formerly promising youth was seemingly in the grip of an annihilating spiritual death spiral. Paul's overpowering pessimism short-circuited his ability to derive fulfillment from any aspect of life or living. He became trapped in a closed existential system articulated so ruthlessly by his intellectual lodestar Schopenhauer, one which emphasized the illusory nature of individuality and belongingness, the inevitability of suffering, and the moral imperative of willful negation. It was at this natural juncture that two contrasting, fateful developments occurred, diametrically opposed events which managed to finally dislodge Paul from his pit of radical pessimism. These jolting upheavals resurrected him from the ashes of his former self and set him on a new intellectual and spiritual trajectory. The first of these upheavals was an incident of shattering trauma. One gray winter morning, Paul's younger brother Jacob came screaming into the house, face contorted in terror. He had discovered their father Johannes hanging by a noose in the woodshed, the reverend's body already growing cold and stiff. The shocking suicide of his father, the person Paul revered above all others, left the young man reeling in anguished bewilderment. How could this seemingly happen? A man of the cloth, a spiritual counselor to the community, criminally taking his own life in such a violent, negating manner. Paul was utterly shaken to his core, his hermetic pessimism shattered by this ultimate injustice he could not rationalize away. He was soon swept up in a numb haze of mourning and logistics as the villagers rallied around the grieving Tillich family. Stifling his own personal turmoil for propriety's sake, Paul was caught up in making arrangements, fielding condolence calls, and taking on responsibilities as the newly appointed patriarchal figure. In the aftermath of the shattering loss, as Paul struggled to discern meaning from the wreckage, a contrasting event arrived like a beacon piercing the miasma. In the mail came an unexpected missive, a letter informing him that he had been awarded a scholarship to study at the prestigious Prussian University in Halle. This represented an opportunity for Paul to escape the crushing gravity of village life that had fostered his all-consuming depression. More importantly, it offered a chance to immerse himself in the rich currents of modern philosophy coursing through the universities. His brilliance recognized, Paul could now explore paths of inquiry and knowledge far beyond dusty Schopenhauer tomes. With a heavy heart following his father's death, Paul prepared to leave Starzeddel and all its agonizing memories behind. He barely recognized the haunted shell of a person he had become during his years in thrall to pessimism's riptide. A part of him would forever remain entombed in that bedroom that was once his philosophical tomb. As the train departed the provincial station, Paul Tillich resolutely turned his gaze forward, his beleaguered spirit injected with a glimmer of optimism. The intellectual expanses of Halle shimmered with possibilities. Perhaps there he could find answers to the questions that tormented him. Or if not answers, at least it offered a new beginning. Chapter 5. Awakenings in Halle. The university town of Halle proved to be a whiplash of a culture shock for the newly arrived Paul Tillich. After years of austere isolation in the modest confines of Starzeddel, he found himself swept up in a cosmopolitan maelstrom of ideas, personalities, and possibilities. Halle's academic halls pulsed with the cross-currents of modern philosophy, theology, psychology, and more. Venerable professors held forth on the latest paradigm-shifting concepts from Kant, Hegel, and Nietzsche. Study groups debated the diverging schools of phenomenology, existentialism, and psychoanalysis. This represented a whole new universe of intellectual exploration light years removed from the provincial insularities of Paul's hometown. At first, the 19-year-old felt overwhelmed and disoriented by the dizzying plurality of it all. Gone were the monolithic certainties about existence, morality, and faith that had grounded Starzeddel's church culture. In their place was an exhilarating but daunting surfeit of radical viewpoints, each proposing divergent lenses on truth, meaning, and the fundamental premises of human existence. Slowly, Paul acclimatized to this unprecedented level of epistemological diversity. He took to haunting the campus philosophical society, absorbing the free-flowing interplay of ideas like a starved castaway tasting fresh water. Conversations about the phenomenological method, or the implications of Nietzsche's perspectivism, stretched long into the nights amid a dizzying daze of pipe smoke. Just as impactful as these abstract notions was Paul's immersion in a radically different social milieu. His new classmates hailed from across Germany and beyond, exhibiting a cosmopolitan eclecticism of beliefs, behaviors, and mores. Having inhabited the severe psychological confinement of Starzeddel society, Paul was almost overwhelmed by the diversity of personalities in the dormitories and lecture halls. Here were iconoclastic bohemian poets, dashing young Marxists denigrating capitalism, and haughty aristocratic science slumming among the academic rabble. The young theologians had spun encountering concepts like sexual liberation, anarcho-syndicalism, and gender nonconformity that seemed radically alien. Most disruptive were the influential factors of two philosophy instructors who took Paul under their contrasting wings like doting fathers. The first was Hans Vaihinger, an accomplished polymath who introduced Tillich to the perspective-redefining implications of Kant and Schopenhauer. It was Vaihinger who helped resurrect Paul's affinity for German idealism after his bout with cynical pessimism. The other mentor was Rudolf Eucken, an idealistic philosopher who encouraged Paul to embrace spiritual experience and ethical universalism as paths to existential authenticity. Where Vaihinger advocated a rationalistic transcendence of solipsism through logic, Eucken preached a holistic cosmic integration of the self with the universal spirit of life. Tillich's intellect proved immensely elastic, able to absorb the most ambitious philosophical systems while retaining his capacity for nuanced, critical analysis. He gradually wove together an idiosyncratic worldview incorporating his conservative theological roots with tenets of phenomenology, historical cultural critique, and quasi-mystical metaphysical leanings. What emerged was a new Tillich, no longer the self-negating ascetic, but a vibrant and Renaissance-minded scholar determined to seek truth via rigorous epistemological examination and consciousness-expanding spiritual and ethical exploration. In the fertile grounds of Halle's University, Paul's long-deferred blossoming into a preeminent 20th-century thinker finally took root. Chapter 6. Forging a Philosophical Path with the Intellectual Nourishment of Halle's Academic Milieu. Paul Tillich underwent a profound metamorphosis from cynical pessimist to an increasingly confident and original philosophical voice. His powerful mind finally found an arena conducive to developing bold new syntheses of thought. No longer did Paul feel compelled to retreat into the nihilistic insularity of Schopenhauer's tragic worldview. Nor was he bound by the provincial dogmatism that had stifled him in Starzeddel. Instead, the kaleidoscopic diversity of perspectives available in Halle emboldened Tillich to fashion his own distinctive philosophical orientation. At the core remained his enduring fascination with the metaphysical and mystical dimensions of human existence. Even during his darkest pessimistic phases, Tillich exhibited an innate spiritual curiosity and attraction to concepts of cosmic consciousness and transcendental self-unification. Studying Eastern philosophies like Buddhism alongside German idealism and existentialism supercharged these proclivities. Tillich avidly explored strategies for cultivating a state of holistic being and heightened awareness, suffusing all aspects of perception and lived experience. He saw these as gateways to apprehending the essences underlying ephemeral worldly forms, a path to grasping the fundamental ground of being that birthed all existence into manifestation. At the same time, his ferociously analytical mind could not simply abandon itself to insular solipsism or abstractions. Tillich's philosophical spirit remained bound to this world, dissecting the ontological quandaries of daily human existence. How could one truly be authentic and act in accord with moral and ethical ideals despite existing in an often unjust, irrational society? This was the seed of Tillich's driving desire to develop a humanistic philosophical framework for confronting the existential struggles faced by all people as beings inevitably thrown into an ambiguous, alienated modern world. He saw his role as providing a cosmic context and coping strategies for the pervasive senses of emptiness, anxiety, and loss of meaning that plagued the psyche under modernity's dislocating pressures. In his lectures and writings, Tillich identified phenomena like the deepening spiritual distress stemming from technology's dehumanizing effects, mass urbanization's rootlessness, and the societal disintegration of unshakable values. Rather than retreating into escapism or nihilism, he pushed his adherents towards a reinvigorated spiritual engagement with existence. This required merging of intellectual rigor and ethical resistance with a rekindling of imagination, vitality, and conscious presence. Only through holistic self-actualization focused on realizing one's unique potentials could one wage an authentic rebellion against the oppressive status quo and those demonic societal forces fragmenting the human spirit. While Tillich's philosophical system grew increasingly idiosyncratic and synthetic, it resonated profoundly with young Germans grappling with modernism's psychic tolls. His lectures drew cult-like followings of pupils, feeling their senses of emptiness and detachment crystallizing under the theologian's insights. With his personal magnetism and cosmopolitan wisdom, Tillich's status soared as a generational prophet articulating the path to transcendence amidst 20th-century alienation. In Halle's hallowed philosophical sphere, Paul Tillich had forged his own distinctive voice, an interconnected spiritual, ontological, and ethical framework for thriving despite modernity's existential discontents. His evolution from a tortured pessimist to a prominent public intellectual had begun. Chapter 7. The Frankfurt Crucible. After establishing his reputation as a singular philosophical voice in Halle, Paul Tillich secured a prestigious appointment in 1929 as a professor of philosophy at Frankfurt University. This prestigious posting would test the mettle of his maturing worldview against the backdrop of Weimar Germany's escalating social unrest and reactionary political forces. The move to the urbanized intensity of Frankfurt represented yet another shock to the system for the once rural theologian. Gone were the hallowed, bucolic environs of Halle. In their place was a churning industrial metropolis increasingly polarized along ideological lines. Labor unions waged fierce struggles against capitalist robber barons, while the incipient Nazi movement sought to capitalize on economic immiseration with furor of hatred and race nationalism. Frankfurt's corridors and beer halls crackled with clashing viewpoints, from ardent Marxists to unrepentant social Darwinists. For Tillich, it proved an edifying but also disorienting immersion into modernity's most alienated, dislocating pathologies that his philosophical system aspired to diagnose and transcend. In the classroom, Tillich preached the potentials of realizing an elevated, spiritual presence by reconnecting with the ineffable ground of being through ethics, art, and contemplative vitality. He encouraged acolytes to resist pursuing meaning through empty materialism and to rebel against the empty seductions of ideological extremism. His courses attracted a diverse array of pupils, from secular Jews fleeing persecution to disaffected daughters of industrialist titans to budding anti-capitalist revolutionaries. While interpretations of his teachings differed, most were compelled by Tillich's penetrating analysis of modern society's existential discontents. Yet for all his theories, Frankfurt's realities increasingly defied systemization. The rapacious forces of fascism, more virulent and racially eliminationist than Tillich could fathom, metastasized with terrifying swiftness. The Sturmabteilung street brawls turned to waves of boycotts, lootings of Jewish properties, and unrestrained violence. Civilized norms of discourse collapsed as intimidation and bloodshed became the city's new language. The horrors unfolded at a deeply personal level for Tillich as well. One day, bands of Nazi thugs descended upon the campus, indiscriminately assaulting Jewish professors in a frenzy of racist savagery. Among those battered was the renowned intellectual and Judaic scholar Martin Buber, one of Tillich's own closest confidants and philosophical collaborators. For the once cloistered village theologian, such depraved episodes shattered any remaining illusions about rationality's supremacy over human baseness. His lofty ideal of raising humanity through metaphysical awakening crashed against the brute forces of tribalism and irrational hatred paralyzing Frankfurt. Soon enough, the Nazis escalated from vigilantism to the levers of institutional power. In these years, Tillich witnessed the systematic dismantling of the pluralistic democracy he championed. The free exercise of conscience, individual liberty, and human dignity he extolled, all subsumed by totalitarian nihilism. As Jewish professionals like Buber lost their livelihoods, Tillich agonized over how to ethically navigate this encroaching damnation. By 1933, the closure of Frankfurt University under the new Nazi regime became inevitable. Most of its prominent Jewish faculty had already fled. The rest were promptly expelled or imprisoned. For ethnic Germans like Tillich, acquiescence was compulsory to avoiding persecution. Yet the philosopher could not simply submit and profess ideological fealty to the Third Reich without violating the deepest tenets of his value system. Ultimately, Tillich chose a third path. leveraging his international prestige to accept an overseas scholarly position and depart Frankfurt with his integrity intact, if also his heart shattered. As he bade farewell, the hellish infernos of Kristallnacht lit the metropolitan horizon. This profound existential trial irrevocably transformed the philosopher into an impassioned critic of injustice committed through the subversion of human reason. Chapter 8. The New World. Fleeing the escalating nightmares of Nazi Germany proved to be Paul Tillich's salvation, but also a profound existential dislocation. In 1933, the philosopher found himself transplanted to the United States as a refugee, an émigré faculty member at New York's Union Theological Seminary. For Tillich, the transition marked an end to the cultured European milieu that had previously grounded his intellectual development. Gone were the hallowed philosophical salons and beer hall debates over Heidegger's dialectics. In their place was an American context starkly more pluralistic, commercial, and grounded in Protestant pragmatism than the Germanic traditions of metaphysical abstraction. The bustling streets of Manhattan presented a vertigo-inducing contrast of sensory inputs from Tillich's former Nazi-gripped environs. Here, successive waves of immigrants speaking a cacophony of tongues crowded neighborhoods segregated along ethnic lines. Consumer capitalism announced itself in garish neon hues advertising earthly indulgences. The very soundscape was alien. Shouting newsies competing with honking taxis and wafts of jazz suffusing smoky cafe atmospheres. Initially, Tillich experienced a sense of profound disorientation and alienation compounded by his outsider status. He found the prevailing American mindsets to be pragmatic to a fault, overly materialistic, and defaulting to an ethos of shallow optimism. These dispositions ran countercurrent to his philosophies rooted in grappling with existential anxiety, estrangement, and explorations of being's subterranean depths. At Union Theological, American students seemed taken aback by Tillich's intensity and perceived him as an eccentric, incomprehensible figure. His lectures on confronting modern meaninglessness with rapturous, spiritual presence elicited occasional derisive laughter and walkouts. Few possessed the European frame of reference to comprehend his heady dialectics integrating phenomenology, psychoanalysis, and religious mysticism. Tillich became a figure of loneliness, an elderly prophet without an indigenous flock to receive his teachings. He struggled to adapt his dense existentialist vocabulary, communicating authenticity's imperatives to a cultural milieu more attuned to the self-help pragmatism of Dale Carnegie. Increasingly, the German émigré grew nostalgic for the intellectual hospitalities of the old world he was cruelly displaced from. A profound depression engulfed Tillich, triggered by his profound uprootedness and alienation from all that was familiar. His already tenuous grasp on mental health destabilized further, as the exile found himself beset by paralyzing psychological lows and somatoform anxieties. There were weeks where the profound ennui rendered him almost catatonic, restricted to his apartment in existential stasis. It was only through cultivating a few intimate friendships, such as those with the Reinhold Niebuhr and Paul Weiss, that Tillich maintained his traction. These philosophical confederates provided sustaining solidarity and conversational shelter from the cultural barrenness he perceived all around him. Their impassioned late-night bull sessions exploring ethics, humanism, and the meaning of democracy proved radically reinvigorating for the depressive émigré's spirit. With time, Tillich's buoyant creative energies gradually reasserted themselves in this adoptive new milieu. He reimagined techniques for conveying his existential perspicacity to American students in more concrete, grounded vocabularies. The alienated foreigner even began dabbling in pop culture media like radio broadcasts to popularize his philosophies. Most crucially, the rise of global fascism reforged Tillich's humanistic resolve to help cultivating pathways for confronting modern meaninglessness and spiritual impoverishment. With Nazi ideologies devouring the European mind, the world needed instructive voices championing consciousness and individual dignity more than ever before. Tillich sensed his role distilling, to serve as a steward of existential truth and spiritual resistance during this climactic civilizational struggle. Chapter 9. Speaking truth to damnation. As World War II's carnage consumed the world, Paul Tillich embraced his role as a witness transcribing philosophy for humanity's fragile existence under modernity's demonic shadows. While physically removed from the Holocaust's European infernos, the émigré thinker remained spiritually shackled to bearing truthful testament. Tillich intently followed the shockwaves of genocidal atrocity rippling outward, carrying first-hand accounts from the remaining Jewish community in Germany. With each successively more harrowing revelation of industrialized killing, ghettoization, and dehumanization, his philosophical frameworks for navigating existence were scorched by unimaginable anguish. In his writings, sermons, and private correspondences, Tillich struggled for vocabulary and metaphysical explanations that could bring coherence and ethical resistance to society's descent into radical evil. He posited the subversion of logos, the secular humanist concept of reason and universality upholding civilization, which had capitulated to the demonic influxes of tribalism, hatred, and violence. Those traditional Western values and Enlightenment ideals Tillich had preached were predicated on human moral transcendence through awareness. Yet that fragile attainment could always be undone by resurgent destructive forces within the collective psyche that reduced man back into a beast. Nazi ideology's pseudo-religious totalism holding racial supremacy as its sacrosanct dogma showed just how swiftly humanity could degenerate when logos succumbed to false prophets and idolatry. Even as global war efforts slowly liberated the death camps, Tillich remained haunted by these seismic collapses of human civilization, these mass tragedies casting the permanence of enlightened progress into doubt. He understood the temptations to reactively turn inward with nihilism, despair, and flight from meaning. Yet for the philosopher, that represented the purest abdication of moral voice and the highest betrayal of cosmic being itself. Tillich instead implored his audiences to confront and stare infinite evil directly in the face, to radically accept its radical existence as undeniable, yet protest its dominion through elevating transcendent love, acts of human solidarity, and the stubborn courage to continue creating truth and beauty. While the demonic may never be exorcised from earthly existence, humanity could never willingly capitulate and allow it to propagate unchecked. That was the grounding from which defiant authenticity and resistance took root. Tillich's wartime works like The Courage to Be and The Shaking of the Foundations became emblematic of his impassioned existential rebellion against 20th-century barbarism and totalitarian dehumanization. He called modern individuals to disavow cheap, fleeting material pursuits in favor of consecrating their lives to the struggle for universal meanings and moral purpose. Only through relentlessly waging that metaphysical battle over courage and dignity could the demonic's advances be rebuffed and mankind achieve transcendence over its own self-destructive underpinnings. The émigré philosopher now spoke for all those who had voices silenced by the centuries' incomprehensible terrors. His exhortations for spiritual resilience in confronting radical evil resounded especially among those who escaped the Reich's extermination projects. For a new generation of refugees and displaced diaspora populations, Tillich's teachings provided a defiant roadmap for discovering affirmation by witnessing truth against monstrous denials of the human spirit. In these conviction-smelting fires, the humble theologian from rural Starzeddel completed his metamorphosis into a titan of humanist existentialism armed for the 20th century's most harrowing ideological confrontations. Tillich would carry that torch of truth-telling and righteous protest onward after the war's conclusion, bracing to engage fresh battles over nihilism and societal corrosion emerging on modernity's horizon. Chapter 10. The courage to be in the waning years of his life, Paul Tillich remained a philosophical sailor steadfastly navigating the existential doldrums of the post-war era. The inhumanities of World War II and the Holocaust instilled in him a profound sense of civilizational fragility, an understanding that hard-won ethical frameworks and social progress could be shattered with shattering rapidity by resurgent destructive forces. Rather than retreating into resignation or cynicism, however, Tillich doubled down on his mission to steer humanity towards transcendent self-actualization even in this arid cultural climate. He saw that the post-war world was increasingly gripped by a soulless, self-devouring materialism, what he termed the totalitarian bourgeois mind. From booming suburbanization to soulless consumerism to humanity's very relationship with technology, people seem to drift deeper into inauthentic conformity and spiritual aridity. In landmark works like The Courage to Be and Dynamics of Faith, Tillich provided roadmaps for rediscovering existential vitality and meaning through reconnecting with the primal ground of being. He called for rekindling imagination, practicing conscious presence, and infusing all aspects of modern life with creative engagement rather than passive spectatorship. The elderly philosopher railed against what he deemed the hatred of the humanists, the insidious societal pressures towards capitulating to empty status pursuits, blind nationalism, and willful ignorance. These forces, stemming from sources as innocuous as corporations exploiting apathy to propaganda machines amplifying xenophobia, all cultivated the numbing allures of turning away from ethical courage in the name of comfort or belonging. Tillich pulled no punches in issuing searing jeremiads against such demonic influences inhibiting human authenticity and self-actualization. With generational remove from World War II's atrocities, he warned that creeping banalities opened the door for history's worst transgressions to repeat themselves. Only an eternal, vigilant rebirth of individual consciousness and the refusal to divorce ethics from existence could forestall that momentum towards inhumanity. His speeches, including the famous The Courage to Be delivered at Yale, electrified campus audiences with a subversive mashup of ecstatic, poetic verbiage merged with penetrating analyses of societal pathologies plagued by dreary allures and nauseating complacencies. A charismatic septuagenarian with inexhaustible passionate vitality, Tillich became a cult figure for 1960s countercultures hungering for salves against bourgeois ennui and vapid conformity. On campuses ignited by the free speech movement, civil rights struggles, and anti-war uprisings, the old existentialist's teachings reverberated powerfully with those protesting society's dehumanizing effects. He urged them to resist being objectified as economic inputs or statistical units, and instead to seek being as wholly realized individuals courageously expressing dissent against injustice. In those final years, Tillich spent nearly as much time in personal exchanges with earnest young seekers as in lecture halls. Whether presiding over his unkempt Hyde Park apartment's cosmic bull sessions or doing LSD with psychologists studying altered states of consciousness, the sage always embodied an unwavering commitment to spiritual expansiveness and shared authenticity. To the end, Paul Tillich remained a defiant vessel for humanity's vast interior cosmos, advocating for transcendent awakenings and acts of faith as antidotes to society's insidious lulling towards existential sleep. He departed this realm in 1965, a fitting envoy passing the torch to successive generations of consciousness explorers. His final written charge to all who would keep that sacred light burning served as both a haunting manifesto and existential love letter to those unfinished. The courage to be is the courage to accept oneself, in spite of being unacceptable. Those parting words distilled the essence of Tillich's philosophical pilgrimage from a life of profound alienation and doubt to one of grounded, defiant self-actualization. They encapsulated his evolution from haunted pessimist to emboldened existential rabbi preaching radical self-acceptance amidst society's ever-encroaching, dreary allures. In the final throes of his life, Paul Tillich had achieved a rarefied plane of inner peace and wholehearted embrace of the human condition. This sanctified state was hard-won through traumas and metamorphoses that shredded his former selves, from the seminarian shackled by dogma to the dispirited atheist to the tenured scribe bearing witness against civilization's descent into genocidal mistakenness. Each seed pearl of agony ultimately became transfigured into a wisdom tradition unto itself. The very dislocations and dark nights of the soul that once tortured Tillich evolved into insights illuminating new pathways for others groping through modern angst and anomie. By delving fearlessly into the pitch of radical doubt, this spiritual seeker surfaced as a true savant for confronting existence undeterred by its ambiguities or terrors. For Tillich, autochthonous courage no longer derived merely from dispassionate philosophical abstractions and systematic constructs. It emanated from the roiling complexities of his personal journey, from having traversed the most daunting existential devastations, yet persevered with integrity virtually unscathed. The voyage's very travails, when metabolized through ruthless introspection and imaginative questioning, became the source of sustenance. In his later life's prolific writings, each page seemed encoded with hard-won arcana pointing towards a profounder, emboldened embrace of human potentialities. Tillich gestured towards emancipating vessels of being from societal constraints and subconscious, dreary allures through cultivating presence, creative vitality, and individual authenticity. All illusory polarities like despair, courage, emptiness, fulfillment were transcended through consecrating existence towards realizing one's unique, virtuous essences. If the human project's objective was confronting infinite with radical lucidity rather than recoiling from existence's cosmic intimations, then Tillich stood as an spirited paragon. Those fortunate witnesses continuing this ultimate metaphysical insurrection through lives of courageous consciousness were reminded that the revolution's headwaters began humbly in a rural village over 70 years earlier. There, a keenly perceptive boy first glimpsed the terror of life's existential void belied by dogma's pat bromides. And like some inceptive black hole birthed into timeless expansion, that breakthrough ushered in an entire universe of uncompromising truth-seeking undertaken with all the ferocity of Tillich's famously keen Teutonic intellect and indefatigable spiritual yearnings. By traversing that life path's dunings and infinitudes with both intellectual rigor and imaginative openness, the philosopher resolved not to accept oneself while denying or negating one's flaws, but rather to embrace within one's very being the journey of conscious evolution required to navigate modern dislocations with audacity and care. Only there, in that rarefied seat of awareness, could humanity discern the metaphysical beacons shimmering at existence's horizons. Such was the path walked and realized by Paulus the village theologian metamorphosed into Tillich the indomitable. Perhaps this final arrival represented neither terminus nor origin, but yet another ellipsis along eternity's exfoliating path, always expanding, continually illuminating through being's mysterious interregnums.